This war did not turn on one missile strike or one headline. It turned the moment the cost of stopping attacks started rising faster than the cost of launching them. That is the real story. Not who fired first, not who claims a tactical win. The real story is that one side may be able to keep shooting cheaply, while the other side is being forced to spend itself into exhaustion just to keep daily life from collapsing. And once that equation flips, the battlefield starts lying to you. What looks like defense starts becoming depletion. What looks like control starts becoming delay. What looks like strength starts becoming a countdown. The clearest sign of that shift is not even coming from generals. It is coming from the insurance market. The price to insure a tanker passing through the Strait of Hormuz did not just move higher. It reportedly jumped from around $250,000 to as much as $12 million for a single transit. Read that again. A passage through one narrow waterway now carries an insurance bill so extreme that it starts breaking the economics of the voyage itself. At that point, you are no longer talking about elevated risk. You are talking about a system warning that the route is becoming commercially intolerable. And that changes everything. Because if ships cannot move normally, oil cannot move normally. If oil cannot move normally, fuel, freight, electricity, food inputs, plastics, chemicals, fertilizer, aviation, manufacturing, all of it starts repricing. Not slowly, not neatly, violently. That is why this conflict is bigger than the missiles people see on social media clips. The visible explosions are only one layer. Underneath them is the hidden detonation, the economic blast radius spreading through shipping, energy, logistics, defense inventories, and basic civilian infrastructure. And once you follow that layer, the war looks very different. This is not just about who can hit harder. It is about who can keep paying for the hit, who can keep replacing what was fired, who can keep markets functioning, and who can survive the financial burden of permanent readiness. That is where the imbalance becomes brutal. If one side can sustain even a limited rhythm of missile launches every day, the defender is forced into a much more expensive routine. Every launch creates alarms. Every alarm triggers intercept decisions. Every intercept decision consumes inventory. Every consumed interceptor has to be replaced through supply chains that are slower, costlier, and more politically exposed than the missiles they are trying to stop. That means the war is not really asking one question. It is asking two at once. How many incoming projectiles can a defender stop today? And for how many weeks can the defender afford to keep doing that before the strain becomes unbearable? That second question is the dangerous one, because it does not show up immediately in dramatic footage. It shows up in procurement, emergency budgets, defense stockpiles, shipping premiums, disrupted workdays, shaken investors, and an economy that starts functioning like a country under permanent siege. That is why even a relatively small number of daily launches can become strategically devastating. Not because each individual missile changes the war, but because the defender has to react every single time. The attacker chooses the moment. The defender pays for every moment. That is the trap. And it gets worse when the attacks are not designed for maximum destruction in one burst, but for long-duration pressure. A steady pace, repeated launches, repeated alarms, repeated shelter orders, repeated interception, repeated stress, repeated cost. That kind of pressure is not cinematic. It is corrosive. It grinds civilian routines. It weakens confidence. It drains inventories. It forces governments into a state of expensive vigilance that cannot be relaxed, because the moment vigilance drops, the next strike lands. So the war stops being a contest of power alone. It becomes a contest of endurance. Now look at what is being targeted, and the long game becomes even clearer. The battle is not only about military positions. It is about economic capacity, refineries, power infrastructure, water systems, industrial facilities, transport nodes, sites that matter because they keep a country functioning, sites that make reconstruction slow, costly, and politically painful, even after the shooting fades. That tells you something important. The objective is not simply to win the present exchange. The objective is to shape the next 20 years. If infrastructure is shattered deeply enough, then whoever governs afterward inherits a damaged state, a rebuilding crisis, a public burden, and a financial hole so large that regional projection becomes secondary to internal survival. That is not just battlefield pressure. That is strategic impoverishment. But there is a problem with relying on that logic. It only works if the side being hit loses its ability to keep retaliating at meaningful scale. And that is where the original assumptions appear to be breaking down. Because destroying visible facilities is not the same thing as destroying dispersed capacity. Hitting known sites is not the same thing as erasing hidden storage, underground launch systems, or distributed production networks. A map can show targets. It cannot always show redundancy. That matters because redundancy is what keeps wars alive after the first shock. If launch systems are hardened, hidden, mobile, or pre-positioned in ways that reduce warning time and preserve continuity, then the initial strike may hurt, but it may not disable. And if it does not disable, then the defender remains trapped in the most expensive part of the cycle, repeated defense against repeatable attack. That is where missile speed and missile design become critical. Fast projectiles shrink reaction windows. They compress the time between detection and impact. They force defensive systems to calculate, classify, assign, and launch under enormous pressure. Even when radar sees the threat, time is not the only problem. Geometry is the problem. Altitude is the problem. Angle is the problem. Saturation is the problem. And saturation is where the math turns ugly. Because a single incoming threat is one thing, a wave is another. A wave combined with decoys, drones, or submunitions is another level entirely. The defender is no longer just trying to intercept an object. The defender is trying to solve a multiplying puzzle under seconds of pressure, using systems that cost dramatically more per shot than the weapons forcing the response. That is not a comfortable equation. It is a punishing one. And if even a handful of projectiles or fragments get through, the strategic result can still favor the attacker. Because the point is not always perfect destruction. Sometimes the point is persistent disruption. Disrupt a refinery and markets react. Disrupt a port and shipping reacts. Disrupt industrial zones and insurers react. Disrupt confidence and capital reacts. Once those reactions begin, they feed each other. That is why the jump in tanker insurance is not some side detail tucked away in maritime paperwork. It is one of the loudest signals in the entire conflict. Underwriters do not price emotion, they price risk. When that pricing blows out to extreme levels, it means the commercial world is saying something governments do not always want to say publicly. The environment has become structurally dangerous. And once shipping enters that zone, supply chains start making different choices. Delays increase. Routes become harder to justify. Buyers hesitate. Operators recalculate. Freight costs move. Energy markets twitch. Then governments are forced into responses that can buy time, but not erase the underlying strain. Strategic reserves can cushion. They cannot normalize a broken route forever. Central banks can calm markets for a while. They cannot produce physical flow where fear has frozen movement. Emergency diplomacy can lower temperature briefly. It cannot instantly make insurers ignore what they are seeing. That is why this conflict risks spreading through prices faster than through territory. Oil above a certain level is not just an energy story. It becomes an inflation story, a growth story, a political story, a credibility story. Europe feels it through gas. Asia feels it through shipping and imports. The Gulf feels it through exposure. Everyone connected to global trade feels it in layers. And then there is the regional vulnerability nobody should ignore: water. In parts of the Gulf, fresh water is heavily dependent on desalination infrastructure. These are not abstract assets. They are survival assets. Fixed, visible, essential facilities that keep dense populations alive. If those facilities are threatened, the problem is no longer just military or economic. It becomes existential. Because a society can absorb market volatility for a while. It can absorb high shipping costs for a while. It can absorb strained air defenses for a while. But it cannot absorb the collapse of water access for long. That is why this war contains a frightening imbalance. Some of the most essential civilian systems are also among the hardest to relocate and the easiest to identify. They do not move. They do not hide. And defending them around the clock is expensive. Again, the same equation returns. Cheap to threaten, expensive to protect. And the defender must stay alert indefinitely. This is exactly why prolonged wars in the region become more dangerous over time, not less. The first days are about shock. The later weeks are about systems. Systems failing, systems stretching, systems revealing which side can tolerate the burden and which side is being bled by it. That same burden is now spreading across multiple fronts. When forces are pre-positioned near borders long before escalation becomes public, that usually signals planning, not improvisation. It suggests a conflict architecture wider than the headlines first admitted. And when air power, logistics, reserve mobilization, and political signaling begin to split across more than one theater, then even a powerful military faces a new problem. Concentration becomes harder. Resources can still be formidable, but they are no longer focused in one direction. That matters because multi-front pressure does not require symmetrical strength. It only requires enough pressure in enough places to complicate prioritization. Which front gets the best defenses? Which site gets the first resupply? Which civilian area gets reinforced coverage? Which threat gets intercepted first if several arrive together? These are not abstract questions. They are the real shape of attrition. And there is another reason decapitation logic may not produce the result people expect. Some systems are vertical. Remove the top and chaos spreads downward. Others are built for continuity. Chains of succession are established. Replacements are ready. Authority is distributed. Response plans exist before the strike happens. In that kind of structure, killing leaders can create anger without creating paralysis. That changes the meaning of targeted assassination entirely. If retaliation occurs within seconds or minutes, if command continuity holds, if pre-approved plans execute without visible hesitation, then the message is unmistakable. The structure absorbed the loss and kept moving. And that is a nightmare for anyone who believed leadership strikes would create operational silence. Because silence never came. The launches continued. The exchanges widened. The economic pressure intensified. The markets kept listening. So now step back and look at the whole picture together. Missiles continue to fly. Interceptors continue to be consumed. Insurance costs around a critical choke point explode. Oil prices rise. Gas prices react. Infrastructure burns. Civilian routines fracture. Defense systems remain active at punishing cost. Water vulnerability hangs over the Gulf. Regional fronts risk widening. And the war starts looking less like a quick campaign and more like an industrial stress test. That is the point many observers still miss. A defender can win many individual engagements and still lose the larger economic contest. It can intercept successfully and still bleed financially. It can claim tactical control and still watch commercial actors reprice the region as unstable. It can damage enemy infrastructure and still fail to stop repeated launches. And if repeated launches continue, then the burden keeps compounding. Day after day, night after night, alarm after alarm, bill after bill. That is why the official narrative and the operational reality can drift apart so sharply. Public messaging speaks in terms of destruction, deterrence, restored control. But markets, insurers, logistics firms, and infrastructure stress tell a different story. They do not care what the press conference says, they care what keeps happening. And what keeps happening is the real measure of the war. If incoming attacks continue at sustainable pace, if defensive inventories are burned faster than they are comfortably replaced, if commercial transit becomes prohibitively expensive, if critical infrastructure remains exposed, if regional partners begin doubting the reliability of promised protection, then the strategic balance is shifting, even if the tactical language has not caught up. That is the hidden cost no one likes to put at the center of the conversation. Not just the cost of launching war, the cost of continuing it, the cost of keeping skies defended, the cost of keeping ships moving, the cost of keeping markets calm, the cost of keeping water flowing, the cost of convincing populations that normal life still exists when sirens keep proving otherwise. And once that cost becomes open-ended, policymakers face the question they tried to avoid at the beginning. Not, can we hit harder, but can we afford to keep defending like this without breaking something larger? Because wars are often sold politically as contests of courage, capability, and red lines. But many of them are decided by replenishment cycles, cash burn, industrial throughput, and the price of maintaining the shield. That is where this conflict becomes so dangerous. The attack side may not need total superiority. It may only need persistence. It may only need enough daily pressure to keep the other side locked inside a more expensive loop. And if that loop stays active long enough, the defender can start losing long before it admits the situation is unsustainable. That is why the $12 million insurance figure matters so much. It is not just a number, it is a verdict. A verdict on risk, a verdict on fragility, a verdict on how quickly the commercial world can translate war into systemic strain. And when that strain hits energy, freight, water, and defense at the same time, the conflict stops being local in any meaningful sense. The battlefield is still regional. The consequences are global. So where does that leave this war? At a point where military headlines alone are no longer enough to understand it. You have to watch the interceptor math. You have to watch the insurance math. You have to watch the energy math. You have to watch the infrastructure math, because that is where the future of the conflict is being written. Not only in launch footage, in spreadsheets, in stockpiles, in water dependence, in shipping decisions, in the brutal asymmetry between the price of attack and the price of defense. And if that asymmetry remains in place, then the side claiming control may still be walking deeper into a trap defined by attrition, not headlines. So here is the real question. If the cost of stopping the attack keeps rising faster than the cost of launching it, who actually holds the long-term advantage? And second question, if commercial markets are already screaming that this corridor has become dangerously unstable, what happens if the pressure intensifies even one level from here? That is the part most people still are not ready to face. Because once a war becomes economically harder to defend than to sustain, the outcome stops depending only on firepower. It starts depending on endurance, on replacement, on money, on time. And time, in this kind of war, may be the most expensive weapon of all. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe now and stay close, because the next phase of this story may not be decided by the next strike alone, but by the numbers moving underneath it that almost nobody is watching.